Thank you very much. It's fabulous to be here. I'd like to thank Susan and Ben for inviting me. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here yesterday. I was at another conference in Manchester, but I was following the Twitter feeds and even contributing to the Twitter feed. So I felt as though I was here, even though I wasn't, if you see what I mean. But I want to tell you a story. And the story that I want to tell you is a story about a project, primarily. This project here, which is a project aspect that Susan referred to. And the important thing about this project, if you see along the tabs at the top, it says digital stories. Now that's the important thing about this project and the most interesting thing that you'll ever see on this website. What lies behind that tab is a bank of around 18 digital stories. I know most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the form of the digital story, but in case anyone isn't familiar, digital stories are typically short 2 to 3 minute films, usually combining still photography, occasionally a bit of video with an audio track, the kind of thing that can be put together on any basic PC or MacBook using the preloaded software. Very easy to use. They generally focused around personal stories, and what you hear is the voice of the person whose story it is. It is usually, editorially controlled to a large extent by the person whose story it is, even if they may have had some professional sort of help just to guide them through the software processes. And the photographs themselves are often from family archives. So it's a unique way of telling personal stories, and was developed in the early 90s by Joe Lambert in Berkeley, California, but came over to the UK in the early part of this century, primarily by the work of the BBC, and the BBC Wales particularly led a very groundbreaking project called Capture Wales, which some people may be familiar with. Here, I say, there's a bank of about 18 digital stories, and they're important, but there's another layer of stories that are important here that aren't contained on the website, and those are the stories that were elicited by the stories. Those are the narratives that were catalyzed, if you like, by people engaging with the digital stories. And I'll explain how we captured those, but because they're of a different nature, they're not part of the public part of the website. So let me just tell you a little bit about project aspect, because it started with a very basic premise, a very simple premise. Simple in one way, very complex in another way. What we were trying to do was to see whether by reframing the public conversation around climate change into a narrative frame, by using storytelling as a way to have that conversation, we might be able to have a wider degree of engagement, especially amongst very large inverted commas coming up here, hard to reach groups. And it was a partnership between ourselves at Falmouth University, led by myself, but also colleagues at my former institution, at what was then the University of Glamorgan and is now the University of South Wales. An SME based in London, a small media company called White Loop, who'd done a lot of work within the public sector, and the communications department at the Department of Energy and Climate Change in Whitehall. And DEC came to us with 3 problems that they wanted to address. The first was that in spite of expensive and extensive campaigns to raise awareness around climate change, the data they were getting was that skepticism and/or disengagement around climate change seemed to be on the increase. So in other words, the more that they were doing, the less effect it was having. The second problem was that they recognized that they had a communication strategy that was largely driven by climate change science, and there's a lot of good but very complex climate change science that we know around this area, and also expert opinion. And it didn't seem to be engaging the broader public in the climate change debate. The third one was that government policy consultations usually engage, as I said, only a small percentage of the population, and usually the same percentage. They said what we get with climate change, we get the 10% who are climate change, I was going to say enthusiasts, but no one's an enthusiast for climate, activists, I suppose. And the other 10%, the other end, are the skeptics and the deniers. And you've got 80% in the middle who don't really engage with climate change, or they come and go on the issue. And these were the people that it was DEC's term, they classified as hard to reach. Now it seems to me, if 80% of the population are hard to reach, there's something fundamentally wrong with your communication strategy. And they accepted that. So we came up with the following research question out addressing those problems. So by recasting this public conversation into a narrative framework, can storytelling, and specifically digital storytelling, broaden and democratise the debate around climate change and encourage deeper and wider levels of engagement? So that's what we were trying to do with the project. But before I get into just explaining what we actually did, let me say where it really began from. Two things. First of all, I was asked by the Arts and Humanities Research Council about 6 years ago now to go to Brazil for a seminar organised by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on the UK-Brazil Year of Science and Innovation, which I'm sure you all remember. And over there I met a guy called Brian Leonard, who was a head of trade at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And he was a senior civil servant, near retirement. I was talking about digital storytelling and health for some reason. I can't remember why. But Brian came to me afterwards and said, I wonder if we could get some storytelling into government policy thinking and policy making. I said, well, that'd be a great idea if you could manage it. And he came back to me a couple of years later when he'd retired and said, Department of Energy and Climate Change, I've got a problem. I've had a word with the Director of Communications. Can you come along? And that's how we got that brokered that conversation with DEC. The other thing was that was happening at the same time. My Pro-Vice Chancellor for research at the time was an engineer. He was a civil engineer, and his specialism was working in disaster zones, in earthquake zones, having buildings that could be resilient to earthquakes. And I didn't really understand it at the time, but he told me that if you want to build a resilient building in an earthquake zone, you don't fill it with concrete and iron, because that actually makes the problem worse. What you do is build buildings that will collapse very easily and very safely. And that's so it's a kind of odd thinking about what does resilience mean in those terms. But he said, could we use storytelling to build resilience? And here's a bit of money to do a little pilot. So I teamed up with a researcher called Lindsay McEwen, Professor Lindsay McEwen, who is here in Bristol now at University of West of England, but at the time was at Gloucester, and she's a geographer, and she was working in Tewkesbury. And we did a project working with flood communities in Tewkesbury to see whether we could capture some of the experience and lay knowledge in the form of digital stories that could then be transferable to other stakeholders within the disaster management or the flood management area. So I'm just going to play you, first of all, one of the stories that we captured from that project to give you an idea of where we started from. So I'm going to cue Ali for the first story, which is from Maggie. Here we go.
That Friday, it had rained all day like mad, and I could see the meadow at the front of the house filling up with water. You could see the water rising pretty fast, so by about 6 o'clock I phoned my brother up. Next thing I know, there's half a dozen hairy men coming, knocking on the door, ready to put all the stuff upstairs. I bought my house knowing it flooded. They usually flood about 6 to 8 inches. We had a flood plan. Got the whole ground floor cleared, everything raised at least 2 feet off the floor, thinking, well, this is fine. Just in time to see the water hit the camber on the road and an 18-inch tidal wave coming across the road towards the house. And all of a sudden, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. And then the next thing, it was a very serene and quiet moment when the water started bubbling up through the floor. We had a cup of tea and just went to bed, stupidly thinking that the water would have gone down by the morning. Next morning, got up, and obviously the water had risen quite a bit. We'd carried out our flood plan, but we're now faced with 4 feet of water in the house. The fridge had floated off the kitchen table, and the sofa was floating around the living room. People imagine you'll panic, and people imagine you'd sit there and cry, and I suppose some people did. But all I could think, well, it's just stuff, and we're all still all right. Now that could be shock. I don't know. I think with the emergency services, things could have been a hell of a lot better if they'd have listened to local people. There was no joined up thinking, there was no communication. After the event, nobody came to offer advice. Got nothing at all. To a large extent, we were all left to our own devices. 2 years on, you look back and suddenly realise all the emotions that you've gone through. You don't realise it at the time, but depression hits big time once the builders have gone. That was the worst time. It was the 2 weeks after the builders had gone, was that you'd feel completely empty. You'd have nothing to do because everything was new. And it wasn't your house, it was a new house. When it rains now, it's nerve-wracking. You just start getting nervous again. You start thinking, shall I put my furniture up? So, am I going to have to go through all this again?
So for all of the explaining of the whole research methodology that I gave to DEC, that was what sold them the idea of getting involved in the project, that 3 minutes from Maggie. Nothing that I said at all. So yeah, we'll have a bit of that, please. That will be interesting. Let's try that one. So we set off and we spent a little bit of time going around the country talking to people who'd be put in contact with us, or we'd got a whiff of somebody's doing something interesting over here. We'll go and talk to them, and they put us in contact with somebody else. And we went around and we collected, as I say, made a bank of 18 digital stories. And we then went into 3 geographical areas. A metropolitan area. We went into London and worked in the community of South Peckham, where we worked with a group of teenagers who were running a radio station. We worked in the Irish Women's Centre. We also worked with groups in Bridgend in South Wales, so a provincial urban situation. And we also worked in West Cornwall in a rural situation, again working with Coast Guard's group and working with a Women's Institute group. And so a real mixture of community groups within those 3 diverse communities. And we played them those stories as a way. We ran workshops, and basically we used some of those stories as a way into the workshops. And what was interesting then, the stories that we'd played then elicited further stories. So we captured the conversational narratives that emerged. And then we went back and did some evaluation about their levels of engagement. So that was the process that we're involved with. And I knew, and there's 2 main challenges here. I knew, having worked for many years in arts research, that you're always dealing with stability. And particularly when you're working with communities, because things are always changing. So you're always having to rethink your research plan, your project plan. What on earth are we going to do now? Because we were relying on this person to help us with recruiting this group of people, and now they've got a job up country and they've moved, or or whatever it might be. There are always things changing. But I did foolishly think that the one thing we could rely on for stability was the good old British civil service. I thought that would be all right. At least we've got DEC involved. During the 18 months of the project, we had 2 governments, 3 ministers, and 5 different directors of communication to deal with. And each time that happened, we had to go back and explain the project and convince them about the value of the project. The other problem we had was around the public attitudes to climate change. And quite frankly, if we went into a group and said, right, we're doing this project about climate change, and then it'd all be vanished, it all disappeared. We were faced with a sceptical public, but also they were sceptical partly because they saw this as a very heavily agendaed issue, but also a government that was wedded to a kind of a particular top-down approach to communication, to which they had no way of engaging with it at all. And we've already had comments about, don't make your audience feel foolish. So much at the forefront, so foregrounded was the climate change science that most people found it very difficult to engage with that in any meaningful way, so chose to turn their backs on it and not engage with it. As a typical example, I think this is a clip you may well be familiar with, but I think it sums up some of the problems that we were having. So the next clip.
Well, whatever happened to global warming, eh?
Mm-hmm.
Stop. From October the 1st, if you say whatever happened to global warming, eh, whenever it's a bit cold or wet, you could be cooling off in a prison cell. This leaflet is being sent to every household in Britain. You have until September the 30th to learn the difference between climate, a long-term trend averaged over many years, and weather, which is what's going on outside the window right now. Make sure you study it, because if you don't, the next shower you get caught in could be in the prison wash block.
Can you look at this weather, eh? Still, I'm sure it'll average out statistically to indicate a long-term warming trend.
Global warming quips. Get acclimatized.
So, there are a lot of very, very smart young climate scientists, researchers based in DEC, really smart people. And they often said to us, one of the problems you've got here is that you're confusing climate and weather. And it's not the same thing. The first thing you must do is make the difference between climate and weather. And I said, well, of course I know the difference between climate and weather. The fact is that people don't experience climate on a day-to-day basis. What they experience is weather. As it was said this morning, what is real is what's happening outside the window. And people do not discuss climate, but you can't stop them talking about the weather, especially extreme weather events. So if you want to get people talking about climate and climate change, then using weather as the gateway into that it seems to me to be a very sensible thing, because that is using people's experience as a way into the wider issue, using something very personal, very local, into something much more global. So as I say, we worked with groups to capture their narrative responses to the stories that we were showing them. And we did get greater levels of engagement. And I think everybody that was in the groups, or the vast majority, said that yes, they were much more engaged in the subject now. They'd gone away and read and talked to people about it. I can't say, I'm not honest, this is where we have to admit our failures, or I don't know whether that is sustainable. In some ways, those are factors outside of our control. I don't know whether those people are still talking about climate change a year on. They may be. I hope some of them are. And I hope when they do, they're doing it in a much more engaged and informed way. Brilliant. What I want to do, though, is show you one more story. And this was the most effective story, because some of our stories were more effective than others. And this is the one that was the most effective.
My name is Heather Rogers, and I've been living and farming here with my family since they moved in 1948, and I was born a few years later, and apart from going to college, I've been living at Ellisvere ever since. So now we just have beef breeding cows and their young stock. So it's all grassland, and we make silage in round bales. Basically, I think I always thought I'd work on the farm, because when I was a little girl, my greatest delight was to go out with my father, and whatever he was doing, I'd be his shadow, I think. I think my favourite job when I was a young girl was when we were lambing. If we had any orphan lambs, my job was to help feed them. And that often meant helping myself as well to the milk. We used to keep them around the corner in our neighbour's meadow, and as soon as I got around the corner, I got a picture of me in there now with my little bonnet on up the top of the camping field. I think that was taken in the snow. I keep a daily diary. I kept a diary ever since I came back from college when I was 21, but my mother kept a diary when we were little. I write what we do every day because the memory's getting more cloudy, and always a weather report. And I only looked up the other day, and this would apply to this spring, and we actually had hotter days on the 19th of February and March than we had on the 19th of July, which makes no sense whatsoever. Fine weather at the right time of growing your crops and rearing your animals is vital, because if you have it too dry and hot in the spring, your crop yields are down, and also if you don't grow grass in the spring, animals are affected and you don't have the winter fodder. If we have too hot a weather, it seems to soon become a problem. Do you know what I mean? Your grassland or your crops, they seem to be stressed out quickly. Over the last few decades, we've noticed that we have more extremes of weather. You used to be able to rely on fine weather in the summer to make hay, but now we seem to get either extremely heavy rain or extremely windy or extremely hot spells of weather, and likewise milder winters than you used to have. So we don't seem to have definite seasons now. They're not defined like they used to be. Consequently, I think there is a definite change in growing patterns. Probably the last 20 years, I think we've seen bigger changes.
So I'll very quickly sum up as that's just playing out, because I think what Heather's story does is raise some very interesting issues around notions of authority and believability and expertise. And I think what it does is challenge the hierarchies of knowledge. And someone from a university, universities are public institutions that are particularly complicit in building up and supporting hierarchies of knowledge. So I'm glad to be able to say I think this is undermining that. And it's around storytelling's duality, I think. The duality that helps us to distinguish between truth and falsehood, and to a kind of Rumsfeldian kind of sort of untrue truths and unfalse falsehoods, you know what I mean? The whole complexity of truth and falsehood, and the multiplicity of truths. Because storytelling is a place where we test out those ideas. And it simultaneously distorts events and brings them into sharper focus that I think makes storytelling particularly helpful for complex issues like climate change. But I would argue that Heather's voice is an authoritative voice, and the communities we work with thought so. It's a voice that's shaped through experience, years of experience of working the land, rather than being the carefully measured voice of the politician, or dare I say it, the academic. It may be an unschooled voice, it's textured by her strong Cornish accent, and might lack in academic authority, yet that's what gives it the authenticity, that gives it the authority. And it's those very attributes that distinguish her from the kinds of voices that are much more commonly heard in the climate change debate. She is an expert. She is the expert truly of her own world. If the project has done anything, and we're hopefully trying to take this forward with other projects and other partnerships at the moment that we're exploring, is that it doesn't replace other kinds of research and data gathering, but it perhaps adds texture to those things. What it has done, I think, is emphasize that ultimately human beings are storytelling animals. And we live by our stories. So it should come as no surprise that if we reframe public policy debate as exercises in narrative exchange, we may be more successful in introducing new and varied voices into the arena. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.